The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine tan powder that coated memories and muffled dreams. It clung to the weathered boards of the general store, settled in the deep lines around Sheriff Brody's eyes, and dusted the brim of the hat that Jack Riley kept, pulled low, as if to hide from a sun that had set years ago. Jack's world had been deliberately shrunk to the boundaries of his small ranch, a quiet purgatory of fence posts and cattle, where the only ghosts were the ones he carried inside him. The past was a locked room, and he had thrown away the key. But the past, Jack was about to learn, knew how to pick a lock. The scream that tore through the noonday haze was the first key turning. It was sharp and terrified, cutting through the lazy buzz of flies and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Jack, his hand resting on a sack of flour in the general store, went still. It was a stillness that was not calm, but coiled the lethal quiet of a predator. Every instinct he had spent 5 years burying clawed its way to the surface. Then came the gunshots, 3 of them, fast and concussive. Not the clumsy boom of a drunkard's pistol, but the confident, rhythmic crack of professionals. The storekeeper, a balding man named Abernathy, dropped behind his counter with a yelp. Outside, the street emptied in a frantic scramble of boots and hooves. Redemption Creek was dying right there in the midday sun. Jack moved toward the door. His steps measured his body, a low, efficient shadow. He didn't want this. He wanted the quiet, the forgetting, the meaningless work that tired his body so his mind could not wander. But trouble, as he knew better than most, finds a man whether he's looking for it or not. He peered through the grimy window. 5 men, their faces masked by bandanas, controlled the street. 2 held rifles, their barrels sweeping methodically across the shuttered windows and alleyways. 3 others were emerging from the bank canvas bags slung over their shoulders. Their leader, however, wore no mask. He stood in the middle of the dusty street as if he owned it. His long coat unbuttoned to reveal a tailored vest and a pair of silver-inlaid Colt peacemakers. His smile was a slash of white in a handsome, sun-darkened face, a smile that held no warmth, only a terrifying theatrical amusement. This was Elias Thorne. Jack didn't know his name yet, but he knew his kind. A wolf who enjoyed the scattering of the sheep. Thorne's gaze swept the street, and for a chilling moment, it felt like he was searching. Not for the law, not for resistance, but for someone specific. His eyes passed over the general store, and Jack felt a cold dread prickle his skin. This wasn't just a robbery. It was an announcement. Sheriff Brody's office was directly across from the bank. The door creaked open, and the old lawman stepped out, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. Brody was past his prime, his movements stiff, his face a roadmap of weariness. He was a good man in a town that had forgotten what good men were for. That's far enough. Thorne Brody's voice was a gravelly rasp, but it carried. This is a dead end for you and your boys. Thorne's smile widened. He made a small theatrical bow. Sheriff Brody, always a pleasure to see a man so dedicated to his office. But I'm afraid you misunderstand. This isn't an end. It's a beginning. He took a deliberate step forward. I'm not here for the town's money. That's just incidental. I'm here for a piece of its history. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, found the window of the general store. They locked with Jack's. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, 100 feet of sun-baked dirt charged with a sudden violent intimacy. Thorne knew he was there. He had known all along. One of Thorne's men raised his rifle toward the store. Boss. No, Thorne said, his voice smooth as polished steel, never breaking eye contact with Jack. Let him come out. It would be rude to conduct this reunion through a window. Jack's hand felt empty. His gun belt, the familiar weight that had been a part of him for 15 years, was back at the ranch, oiled and stored in a wooden box, like a relic of a dead faith. He was a rancher now, a man of calloused hands and quiet days. But the man in the street was calling to the ghost, the lawman they once called Silent Hand Riley. He had no choice. To stay inside was to let Brody die alone. He pushed the door open and stepped into the blinding glare. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Thorne's smile was triumphant. There he is, Jack Riley, looking just as I remembered. A little older, a little sadder. The weight of the world, Marshal, or just the weight of your own sin. The title hit Jack like a physical blow. Marshal. A name he hadn't answered to in 5 years. I don't know you, Jack said, his voice rough from disuse. Oh, but I know you, Thorne replied, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. I know all about you. I know about the badge you turned in. I know about the fire. And I know about the little silver locket you wear to remind you of what you lost. Jack's hand went instinctively to his chest, to the lump of cool metal beneath his shirt. It was a simple oval locket tarnished with age. Inside were 2 faded miniature portraits, one of his wife Sarah, her smile soft and forgiving. The other of his daughter Lily, her eyes wide with a light that had been cruelly extinguished. It was all he had left. This performance is over, Brody warned, taking a half step forward, the shotgun now tight against his shoulder. Drop your weapons. Thorne ignored him. His focus was entirely on Jack. I've come a long way to find you, Riley. To find this town. I'm buying up land, you see. Ranches, water rights. I'm building a new kind of kingdom here. But every kingdom needs a king, and every king needs a crown. I'm not interested in one made of gold. With a speed that was almost inhuman, Thorne drew one of his Colts. He didn't aim at Brody. He fired into the dirt at the old sheriff's feet, sending up a cloud of dust. Brody flinched, but held his ground. Thorne's men, however, leveled their rifles at him, their intent clear. The sheriff was pinned. Thorne walked slowly toward Jack, his boots scuffing softly in the dirt. He stopped a few feet away, the scent of expensive cologne and gun oil hanging in the air around him. You buried yourself out here, Thorne murmured, his voice now a low, venomous whisper. Hoping the world would forget Jack Riley. But some things can't be forgotten. Some debts can't be paid with silence. Before Jack could react, Thorne lunged. He wasn't a brawler. His movements were precise, economical. A sharp blow to Jack's stomach doubled him over, stealing his breath. As Jack gasped, Thorne's hand shot out, his fingers hooking the chain around Jack's neck. With a savage tug, he ripped it free. The locket fell into Thorne's palm. He held it up, letting it twist in the sunlight. There it is, he said, his voice filled with a sick reverence. The heart of the great Marshal Riley. So small, so fragile. A blind, white-hot rage and emotion Jack hadn't felt since the night of the fire surged through him. He straightened up, a guttural roar tearing from his throat, and launched himself at Thorne. It was a raw, desperate attack, and Thorne, anticipating it, simply sidestepped. Jack stumbled past him, and one of Thorne's men slammed a rifle butt into the back of his knees. Jack's legs buckled and he fell hard, his face hitting the unforgiving dirt. He looked up, dust and humiliation stinging his eyes, to see Thorne smiling down at him. The villain opened the locket, glanced at the portraits inside, and then snapped it shut. Beautiful, Thorne said softly. He pocketed the locket. I'll take good care of it for you. He turned to his men. We're done here. He mounted his horse with fluid grace, his men following suit. He paused, looking down one last time at Jack, a broken figure kneeling in the street of a terrorized town. "This is just the first payment." Riley Thorne called out, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "The interest is going to be considerable." With a final mocking tip of his hat to Sheriff Brody, Elias Thorne and his men galloped out of town, leaving behind 2 dead bank tellers, a cloud of dust, and the hollowed-out shell of Jack Riley's quiet life. Jack remained on his knees, his hand clutching his empty collar, the phantom weight of the locket a burning brand on his soul. The locked room of his past hadn't just been opened. It had been kicked down, its contents desecrated and stolen, and the ghost of Silent Hand. Riley was now standing in the ruins, wide awake and screaming for blood. The dust settled, and a new, heavier silence fell over Redemption Creek. Sheriff Brody lowered his shotgun, and the tension draining from his shoulders, leaving only the familiar sag of defeat. He walked over to Jack, his boots leaving deep prints in the dirt beside the imprints of Jack's knees. "You all right?" Jack Brody asked. His voice was tired, but there was a flicker of concern in his faded blue eyes. Jack didn't answer. He pushed himself to his feet, his movements stiff and mechanical. He brushed the dust from his clothes, his gaze fixed on the empty horizon where Thorne had disappeared. The rage had subsided, replaced by a cold, dense emptiness that felt heavier than any mountain. He had lost them once to fire. Now he had lost their memory to a thief. "Some men you can reason with," Brody said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Thorne ain't one of 'em. He's a storm on the horizon, and we're right in its path." He looked at Jack, his expression grim. "He knew you. Called you Marshal." "That was a long time ago," Jack said, his voice a low rasp. "Time don't mean much to a man with a grudge," the sheriff countered. And that man had a grudge the size of the territory. What he did, stealing that locket, that wasn't robbery. That was personal. Jack finally looked at him. The vacant look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hard, metallic glint. It was a look Brody recognized from wanted posters and campfire stories, the look of a man who had made a decision. "I need my gun, Brody." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Figured as much. Trouble finds a man, whether he's looking for it or not, Jack?" "It found me," Jack confirmed. "Now I'm going to find it." He turned and walked away, not toward his ranch, but toward the livery. He didn't look back. The rancher was gone, left behind, in the dust of the main street. In his place walked a man with a singular, consuming purpose. He was no longer hiding from his past. He was hunting it down. The ride back to his ranch was a blur of cracked alkali flats and skeletal saguaros. The sun beat down, making the air shimmer like liquid glass. But Jack felt a chill deep in his bones. His small homestead, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage he had built for himself. Inside the sparse cabin, he went to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He lifted the lid, the hinges groaning in protest. There, nestled in dark oiled leather, lay his Colt .45, the Peacemaker. Its grip was worn smooth from 1,000 draws, its weight a familiar and terrible comfort in his hand. He strapped on the gun belt, and the leather creaking like an old ghost. It settled on his hips, a perfect damning fit. The man in the mirror was a stranger, a harder, colder version of the rancher who had ridden into town that morning. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, his mouth a permanent grim line. Silent Hand, Riley was back. His first stop was Brody's office. The sheriff sat behind his desk, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass before him. He looked up as Jack entered, the gun on Jack's hip, drawing his immediate attention. "Knew you'd be by," Brody said, gesturing to a spare chair. "Heard you were the fastest draw this side of the territories. Never saw it myself." "You don't want to," Jack said, remaining standing. He needed information, not reminiscence. "Thorne, what do you know?" Brody sighed, pouring himself a drink. Not much. He rode in about a month ago with a dozen men and a fat bankroll. Started buying up land, ranches that were failing homesteads that were abandoned. Paid in cash, no questions asked. People were happy to sell. He's got the whole northern valley now, all the way to the Dragoon Mountains. Water rights too, Jack asked. Every last one. He owns the river now. If he wanted, he could turn this whole region to dust inside a year, Brody confirmed. We thought he was just another rich cattle baron with big ideas. But after today, this ain't about cattle. It's about me, Jack stated flatly. Looks that way, Brody agreed. Which brings up a question I probably should have asked 5 years ago. Who the hell are you running from, Jack? Jack's jaw tightened. The past he had refused to speak of was now the only map he had. I wasn't running. I was finished. I was a federal marshal out of Laramie. Put away a lot of men. Killed a few when I had to. It was a job. And the fire, Brody asked gently. The question hung in the dusty air. Jack walked to the window, staring out at the town Thorn had violated. It was 5 years ago. The same night I brought in the last man I ever arrested. A rustler named Caleb Warren. He resisted. There was a struggle. He didn't make it to the jailhouse. Jack's voice was devoid of emotion, a recitation of a report he had filed a lifetime ago. I went home. House was on fire. My wife Sarah, my daughter Lily, they were trapped inside. He paused, his knuckles white where he gripped the window frame. They said it was a faulty flue in the chimney. An accident. You don't believe that, Brody said. It wasn't a question. I wanted to. Jack admitted, his voice cracking for the first time. It was easier than believing someone could. I told myself it was a tragic accident. I buried them. I buried my badge, and I came here to be forgotten. And now Thorn shows up talking about your sins, Brody finished. You think he's connected to this Caleb Warren? It's the only thing that makes sense, Jack said, turning from the window, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. This isn't just a grudge. It's a ghost. And Thorn is its messenger. His investigation began not with a bang, but with the quiet, painstaking work of tracking a phantom. He started with the ranches Thorn had bought. He rode out to the Bar W, a sprawling property that bordered his own. The family that had owned it for generations, the rights were gone. In their place were Thorn's men, hard-faced gunslingers with watchful eyes, who made it clear Jack wasn't welcome. He saw them damming the creek, diverting the water flow toward Thorn's central holdings. It was a strategic, systematic takeover. He spoke to displaced ranchers who had drifted into town, men with sun-cracked faces and the hollow eyes of the defeated. Their stories were all the same. Thorn's offers were generous at first, but if refused, things started to happen. Fences were cut. Wells were poisoned. Cattle went missing. It was a slow, suffocating squeeze, expertly applied, until selling was the only option left. Thorn wasn't just buying land. He was erasing the people who were on it. Days turned into weeks. Jack became a shadow on the edge of Thorn's growing empire, observing, gathering information. He learned the routes of Thorn's supply wagons, the locations of his line camps, the names of his lieutenants. But he could find nothing that directly linked Thorn to Caleb Warren. It was a dead end, a cold trail that only deepened the mystery. Thorn's motives remained shrouded, making his actions seem all the more sinister and illogical. Why this elaborate, expensive scheme? Why the methodical destruction of an entire valley? The town of Redemption Creek lived in a state of quiet terror. Thorn's men would ride in for supplies, their arrogance a constant reminder of who was in charge. They drank in the saloon, their laughter loud, and mocking their guns worn openly. Sheriff Brody was powerless. He had 2 deputies and a town full of scared citizens against Thorne's private army. He could only watch and wait for the inevitable explosion. Jack felt the weight of that fear. He had come to this town seeking anonymity, but in his silence, he had become a part of its fabric. He saw the way the blacksmith's wife pulled her children inside when Thorne's men rode past. He heard the nervous whispers in the general store. The humiliation Thorne had inflicted on him had also been an attack on the town's fragile sense of security. His personal quest for vengeance was becoming inseparable from the fight for Redemption Creek's soul. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A young ranch hand, barely 18, who had worked for Thorne for a week before quitting in disgust. Jack found him drowning his shame in the saloon. The boy named Billy was terrified, but guilt-ridden. "They ain't ranch hands, Mr. Billy," slurred his eyes wide with fear. "They're killers. I saw 'em. Thorne, he's different. He reads books. He talks like a preacher, but his eyes, they're like a snake's." "Where's he staying?" Jack asked, his voice low and intense. "The old McGregor place," Billy whispered. "It's his headquarters. Big stone house up in the canyon. He's got it guarded like a fortress." He hesitated, then leaned closer. "I saw something else. In his office. He's got a wall, covered in papers. Maps and deeds mostly. But in the middle, there were old newspapers. Yellowed. Pinned right to the wall." "What did they say?" Jack pressed. Billy's face paled. "I only got a quick look. But the headline, I remember it. It said, 'Marshall's family perishes in tragic blaze.'" The air left Jack's lungs. It was the confirmation he had been dreading and seeking. Thorne hadn't just heard stories. He had studied them. He had obsessed over them. This wasn't about land or water. It was an elaborate stage, and the fire that had destroyed Jack's life was the backdrop for the final act. Jack left the saloon, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Thorne's land grab wasn't illogical. It was symbolic. He was buying up the world around Jack, isolating him, creating a kingdom of misery on the ashes of Jack's past. He was dismantling Jack's new life piece by piece before going for the kill. He knew he had to get inside that house. He had to see those papers for himself. He had to find the final missing piece that connected Thorne to the night his world burned. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, Jack rode toward the McGregor Canyon. He left his horse a mile away and proceeded on foot, a ghost moving through the chaparral. The stone house was a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky, a few windows glowing with faint lamplight. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter, their rifles glinting in the faint light. Jack watched their patterns, his patience a weapon honed over years of tracking men who didn't want to be found. He waited for the precise moment the guards were at opposite ends of their patrol and slipped over the low stone wall, melting into the shadows of the courtyard. Thorne's office was on the ground floor, its window slightly ajar to catch the cool night breeze. Jack moved toward it, his boots silent on the flagstones. He was a breath away from the window when a voice smooth and laced with amusement cut through the darkness from behind him. "I was wondering when you'd finally pay me a visit, Marshall." Jack froze, his hand hovering over the butt of his Colt. Elias Thorne stepped out from the deep shadows of the porch, a cheroot glowing in his hand. He wasn't surprised. He had been waiting. "Your security is sloppy," Jack said, his voice a low growl. Thorne chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Not at all. My men are trained to spot an army. I, however, was looking for a ghost." He took a drag from his cheroot, the orange tip illuminating his sharp features. "You've been a busy man, Riley. Stirring up my workers, asking questions in town. I must admit, I'm impressed. The fire didn't burn the fight out of you after all. It just banked the embers. "Give me the locket, Thorn," Jack demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. "All in good time," Thorn said, waving a dismissive hand. "First a history lesson, since you seem so determined to uncover it." He gestured toward the open office door. "Please, come inside. See what I've built for you." It was a trap. Jack knew it. But the answers he craved were inside that room. With his hand still resting on his gun, he walked past Thorn and into the office. The room was furnished with a strange mix of rugged frontier practicality and refined elegance. A heavy oak desk stood in the center, but against the far wall was a bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes of poetry and philosophy. And then Jack saw it. The wall Billy had described. It was a meticulous, insane collage. Maps of the valley were pinned next to property deeds, but in the center, forming a dark heart, were the newspaper clippings. "Lawman's heroics end in tragedy. Faulty flue blamed in Riley fire." And next to them, another set of clippings older and more faded. The headline read, "Rustler Caleb Warren killed resisting arrest." Beneath that headline was a small smudged photograph of the man Jack had killed. A young man with defiant eyes and a stubborn jaw. And standing next to him in the photo, a much younger boy with the same eyes, the same jawline, and the unmistakable beginnings of the cruel smile Jack had come to know so well. "He was my brother Thorn," said his voice losing its theatrical charm, replaced by a raw, guttural hatred. He had followed Jack into the room and now stood by the desk. The final piece slammed into place. This was never about the land. It was about blood. "He wasn't a rustler." Thorn spat, his composure cracking. "He was a boy trying to feed his family. Your family. He worked for my father, and when my father died, he tried to keep the ranch afloat. He took a few of your precious Cattle King strays. And for that, the great Marshal Riley, the silent hand, put a bullet in his back." "He drew on me," Jack said, the words tasting like ash. The official report. The lie he had told himself for 5 years. Liar, Thorn roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "My brother wasn't a killer. You murdered him in cold blood because it was easier than bringing him in. You were the law, but you were also the executioner." Thorn's eyes were wild, his face contorted by a grief that had festered into a monstrous obsession. "That same night, the night you killed him, your house burned down. A tragic accident. The universe, it seems, has a sense of justice after all. It took from you what you took from me. An eye for an eye, a family for a brother." He began to pace his movements, agitated, a caged animal reliving its torment. "I was just a boy. I found him in the street bleeding out while you were filing your tidy self-serving report. I swore that day that I would repay you. Not with a quick bullet. That's too easy. That's your kind of justice. No. I wanted to destroy your world just as you destroyed mine. I wanted you to watch your life turn to ash all over again." He stopped and turned to face Jack, a chilling calm settling back over him. "This valley. This is my monument to my brother. Every ranch I bought, every man I drove out, it was all to build a wasteland with you at its center. I was going to leave you with nothing but the dust and the memory of what you'd lost, again." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the silver locket. He let it dangle from his fingers, a pendulum marking the final seconds of Jack's old life. This, Thorn said, his voice dropping to a whisper, was to be the final piece, the soul of the man who took everything from me. He sent the locket to Jack, a taunting invitation. He wanted this. He had orchestrated this entire elaborate slow-burn revenge to get to this single moment, a final confrontation. He was goading Jack, pushing him toward the violence that had started it all. "You want it back," Thorn sneered, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his own silver-inlaid Colt. "Come and take it. Show me the man who killed my brother." The office was a tinderbox filled with the suffocating weight of 5 years of grief and hatred. All it needed was a spark. And Jack Riley, his hand on his gun, his soul stripped bare, was about to provide it. The world narrowed to the space between the two men. The leather-bound books, the maps, the ghosts on the wall, they all faded away. There was only the locket twisting in Thorn's fingers and the promise of a violent end. He drew. The hammer clicked. Dust and thunder followed. But the shot wasn't Jack's. It came from the window, shattering the glass and the tense silence. Thorn grunted, stumbling back, a dark stain blossoming on his shoulder. He dropped the locket, which clattered to the floorboards. Sheriff Brody stood in the shattered window frame, his shotgun smoking. "Party's over, Thorn." Thorn's men, alerted by the shot, were shouting outside. Brody was exposed, a lone target. "Get out of here," Jack Brody yelled, levering another shell into the chamber. "This ain't your fight anymore." But it was. It had always been his fight. Jack scooped the locket off the floor, its cool metal a solid grounding presence in his palm. Thorn, clutching his shoulder, snarled in a rage that eclipsed his pain. He kicked the heavy desk, sending it crashing over, creating a barricade. He fired his Colt blindly toward the window, forcing Brody to duck back. "You won't take me." Thorn screamed, his voice unhinged. "Not him, not you." Gunfire erupted from the courtyard. Thorn's men were closing in. Jack knew this room was a death trap. He grabbed Thorn's arm, hauling the wounded man toward a back door. Thorn fought back, a wild animal, but the pain in his shoulder and the surprise of the attack gave Jack the advantage. "Where are we going?" Thorn hissed, struggling against Jack's grip. "Somewhere we can finish this," Jack grunted, kicking the back door open. They spilled out into the darkness behind the house just as Thorn's men burst through the front. The Dragoon Mountains loomed behind the property, a serrated wall of black stone. Jack knew the area from his scouting. He knew about the old abandoned silver mine, the Widow's Maw, a treacherous labyrinth of tunnels that honeycombed the main peak. It was a place where a man could disappear. It was a place for a final reckoning. He shoved Thorn forward toward the dark maw of the mountains. "Move." As they scrambled up the rocky incline, the first gusts of a rising wind whipped at them, carrying the grit of the desert. The sky, once clear, was being consumed by a roiling wall of black and brown dust. A sandstorm was coming. The heavens themselves were descending to bear witness. The entrance to the Widow's Maw was a jagged scar in the mountainside. The wind howled around it, a mournful cry that seemed to emanate from the earth's own throat. Jack shoved Thorn inside, into the suffocating pitch-black dark. The air was cold, stale, tasting of rock and forgotten time. Behind them, the world was being erased by the storm. The shouts of Thorn's men were swallowed by the wind's roar. They were alone now, trapped in the belly of the beast. Jack pulled a small tin of matches from his pocket and struck one. The flame flickered wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that made the tunnel walls seem to breathe. Thorn leaned against the rock, his face pale, his breathing ragged. The wound in his shoulder was bleeding freely, staining his fine vest a deep crimson. Clever Riley Thorn rasped a pained sneer on his lips. "Bringing me to a tomb. Is this how you dispense justice, a bullet in the dark where no one can see?" "I'm not here for justice." Jack said, his voice flat and cold. He lit a rusty old lantern he found near the entrance, and its steady golden glow pushed the oppressive darkness back a few feet. "I'm here for an ending." A low groan echoed from deep within the mine, the sound of stressed timbers and shifting rock. The storm outside was intensifying its pressure, bearing down on the ancient, unstable structure. Dust trickled from the ceiling. A timer had been set. Thorn, using the wall for support, pushed himself upright. He still held his Colt, its silver inlay catching the lantern light. My men will find us. They'll find our bodies. Jack countered his own gun, steady in his hand. This whole mountain is coming down. The reality of their situation seemed to settle on Thorn, stripping away the last of his theatrical bravado. His eyes, burning with feverish hatred, held a new glint of desperation. This wasn't the grand finale he had planned. The gunfight began without warning. Thorn fired the shot, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet ricocheted off the rock wall near Jack's head, showering him with stone splinters. Jack dropped, rolling behind a pile of rubble as Thorn scrambled deeper into the mine, disappearing around a bend in the tunnel. The hunt was on. It was a cat-and-mouse game in a collapsing maze. Jack followed, guided by the bloody trail Thorn left on the tunnel floor. The air grew thicker with dust, making each breath a struggle. The groan of the mountain was constant now, a death rattle that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He found Thorn in a large cavern, a central chamber where multiple tunnels converged. Old mining equipment, rusted carts, and rotting timbers littered the floor. Thorn was crouched behind an overturned ore cart, reloading his pistol. "You took my brother's life." Riley Thorn's voice echoed in the cavern, strained and raw. "You owe me that life." "Your brother drew on a federal marshal." Jack yelled back his words, a desperate attempt to cling to the crumbling fiction he had built his guilt upon. He made his choice. A massive tremor shook the cavern. A section of the ceiling collapsed near the entrance, sealing them in with a deafening roar of falling rock. The lantern flickered, threatening to die. They were entombed. The shared fate did not create a truce. It heightened the desperation. Thorn rose from behind the cart, firing wildly. Jack returned fire, his shots precise, aimed not to kill, but to disable. One of his bullets struck the rock above Thorn, and a shower of stone rained down on him. Thorn cried out and fell, his pistol skittering across the cavern floor. Jack advanced, his gun trained on the injured man. Thorn lay on his back, his good arm clutching his wounded shoulder, his face a mask of agony and defeat. He was broken. The great Elias Thorn, the architect of ruin, was just a man bleeding out in the dark. Jack stood over him, the peacemaker rock steady in his hand. This was the moment, the culmination of 5 years of pain. Vengeance was a simple pull of the trigger away. Sarah's face flashed in his mind. Lily's. He could avenge them. He could silence the ghosts for good. Do it. Thorn choked out a bloody froth on his lips. He started to laugh, a terrible gurgling sound. Finish it. Be the monster I always told myself you were. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. Jack, don't. The voice came from one of the adjoining tunnels. Sheriff Brody emerged from the darkness, covered in dust, a lantern held high. He must have followed them, braving the storm and the collapsing mine. His face was grim. "This ain't the way," Brody said, his voice heavy with the weight of the law he represented. "He deserves to hang. Let the law handle this. Don't become him." The law. The very thing Jack had abandoned. The thing he had once embodied. He looked from Brody's weary, pleading face to Thorn's mocking, pain-filled one. He was caught between vengeance and justice, between the past and he was trying to escape, and the future he had a chance to build. The law. Thorn wheezed his laughter, turning into a wet cough. "You want to talk about the law?" He pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes locking on Jack's, and in them Jack saw not just hatred, but a profound, bottomless sorrow. "My brother wasn't a killer," Riley Thorn whispered, and the world stopped turning. he never fired a shot in his life. He went to your house that night to warn you. Jack stared, uncomprehending. Warn me? The cattle king you worked for? He'd had enough of the rustling. He hired men to burn out the homesteads of anyone he suspected. My brother heard them talking in a saloon. He knew they were going to your place next. He idolized you, you fool. The great Marshal Riley. He thought you were a hero. He went to your house to tell you to warn you about the fire. The foundation of Jack's world disintegrated. The tidy report, the narrative of a good man's tragic loss, the righteous anger that had fueled him, it all turned to dust. The fire. Jack breathed the words barely audible. They said it was the flu. The fire was already started when he got there. Thorne cried tears of rage and grief streaming through the grime on his face. He saw the flames. He ran inside. He was trying to get to your wife and child. He died in that house, Riley. He died trying to save them. And you shot him in the street and called him a rustler because you found him near your property with a stolen horse, the horse he rode to try and save your family. The secondary twist, the final painful truth, landed with the force of a physical blow. Jack staggered back, his gun lowering. His grief had been built on a lie. His guilt was real, but it was for the wrong crime. He hadn't just failed to save his family. He had killed the man who tried. Thorne's entire life of vengeance had been fueled by a tragic grief-fueled misunderstanding. He had blamed Jack for a murder that never happened, while Jack had been haunted by a tragedy he had completely misread. They were two men broken by the same fire, each blaming the other for the burns. The mountain gave a final tremendous groan. The roof of the cavern began to crack and splinter. "We gotta go," Brody yelled, grabbing Jack's arm. "Now." Jack looked down at Elias Thorne, no longer seeing a monster, but a reflection of his own pain, a man broken by a story. He holstered his pistol. Vengeance was a hollow, meaningless thing now. There was only the shared, unbearable weight of the truth. He bent down and with Brody's help lifted the semi-conscious Thorne, draping his arm over his shoulder. Together, the two lawmen, one old and one broken, dragged the man who had tried to destroy them through the collapsing tomb, searching for a way back to the light. They found a narrow ventilation shaft, a desperate crawl toward a sliver of gray light. With the last of their strength, they pushed and pulled, emerging onto the mountainside, just as the main entrance to the Widow's Maw collapsed in on itself, with a final thunderous sigh, forever sealing the ghosts within. The sandstorm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, the air sharp and cold. Thorne was unconscious, his life hanging by a thread. Brody looked at Jack, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and respect. "You did the right thing, Jack." Jack didn't feel like he had done the right thing. He felt empty. The fire of vengeance that had burned in him for weeks was gone, leaving behind only the cold ashes of the truth. He had chosen justice over revenge, but it brought him no peace. The falling action was quiet, as gray and subdued as the post-storm sky. A posse led by one of Brody's deputies found them on the mountainside. Thorne was still alive. They strapped him to a horse and began the slow, grim procession back to Redemption Creek. He was handed over to federal marshals who had been tracking his gang for months. They took him east toward a trial and a hangman's noose. Justice would be served cold and impersonal. Jack returned to a town that looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear. He was no longer just the quiet rancher. He was the ghost who had faced down a demon and won. But he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a fraud, a man haunted by a truth more terrible than any lie. He spent a long evening in Brody's office, the whole story finally laid bare between them. The two men sat in silence for a long time. The weight of the shared history, the accidental fire, the mistaken identities, the double tragedy filling the small room. Grief's a powerful poison. Brody said, finally breaking the silence. It made him a monster. And it almost did the same to you. Jack nodded, his gaze distant. What do I do now, Brody? You live, the old sheriff said simply. You stop running from the ghosts, and you start living. That's the only way to honor any of them. The marshals returned Jack's locket before they left. It felt different in his hand now. Heavier. The faces of his wife and daughters seemed to look at him with a sad, forgiving wisdom. For 5 years the locket had been an anchor to his grief, a way to keep the wound fresh. Now it was just a memory, a part of a story that was finally terribly complete. He walked through the town, which was slowly coming back to life. He saw the blacksmith working at his forge, the shopkeeper sweeping his stoop. And he saw her, a little girl no older than Lily, had been sitting alone on the edge of the water trough. She was an orphan, her parents taken by fever the winter before, now a ward of the town. He had seen her before, a small, sad shadow on the edge of things. He approached her slowly. She looked up, her eyes wide and wary. He knelt down so he was at her level. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he held out the silver locket. This was for someone I loved very much, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She would have wanted someone else to have it now, to keep them safe. The girl hesitated, then reached out with a small, trembling hand and took it. She opened it, her eyes studying the faded portraits within. They're beautiful, she whispered. Yes, Jack said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in years. They were. He stood up and walked away, leaving the girl clutching the silver oval. He felt lighter. The act of giving it away wasn't an act of forgetting. It was an act of letting go. The locket was no longer a memento of his past, but a promise for her future. He walked to the edge of town, looking out at the vast, open country. The sun was setting, painting the serrated peaks of the Dragoon Mountains in hues of crimson and gold. He wasn't sure what came next. Perhaps he would stay, become a protector for the community he had helped save. Perhaps he would ride on. But for the first time since the fire, the path ahead was not shrouded in the darkness of his past. It was open, uncertain, and his own to choose. He had confronted his ghosts in the belly of the mountain and emerged not whole, but free. The silence within him was no longer an absence of sound, but the quiet beginning of a new chapter.